Among the most distinguishable characteristics of the Catholic Church is the celibacy requirement for its clergy. By rule, and with only a few exceptions, priests and bishops are not married. But this was not always the case, and it is not the case in the equally ancient Eastern Church. Where did this practice come from, and will we ever see a day when it is no longer required? This is Catholicism in Focus. Before we begin our historical look at the issue, it's important that we define some terms. A lot of people use the word celibacy without actually knowing what it means.
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Technically speaking, celibacy simply means to be unmarried. This is distinguished from chastity, a form of the virtue temperance, which moderates sexual activity appropriate for one's state of life, and continence, which is the complete abstinence from sexual activity. You can be celibate without being chaste, and you can be chaste without being celibate. All people are called to be chaste, all unmarried people are required to be continent, but only priests must be all three. Now, why is that? Let's start with Scripture. We know that Jesus himself was unmarried, despite what you may have read from some clickbaity articles online. There's absolutely no evidence to the idea that he married Mary Magdalene. Besides his own personal witness, he explained to his disciples why celibacy was a noble choice of life. In Matthew 19, he provides 3 reasons why someone would not get married. Some are incapable of marriage because they were born so, some because they were made so by others, some because they have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Whoever can accept this ought to accept it. In this short passage, we gain insight into Jesus' own decision, something that St. Paul would later explain to the people of Corinth. I should like you to be free of anxieties. An unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But a married man is anxious about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and he is divided. Basically, it's about preparing oneself for and being a sign of the kingdom, where there will be no giving or taking of marriage. Those who freely choose this are honored by God. It's for this reason that celibacy seems to have been a noble choice for priests and bishops from the beginning. While some, like St. Peter, remained married, many others, like St. Paul, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Polycarp of Smyrna, and St. Justin Martyr, all dedicated themselves to the practice of celibacy. This is not to say, however, that this was required from the beginning or even the norm. 1 Timothy 3 explicitly allows bishops to be married once, and it was not uncommon in the first few centuries of the Church for both bishops and priests to be married. Such prohibitions took time to develop. The most ancient decree we have comes from the Council of Elvira in 305, in which the Church mandated that clergy were to remain continent even if married. We decree that all bishops, priests, and deacons in the service of the ministry are entirely forbidden to have conjugal relations with their wives and to beget children. Should anyone do so, let him be excluded from the honor of the clergy. What's significant about this is not just that it's a very early prohibition against sexual activity, but that its wording gives little indication that this is a new law. As argued by Roman Cholich, the secretary of the Apostolic Exarch for Ukrainian Catholics, the seriousness of the implications for the life of the clergy, the absence of justification for the strictness of the discipline, and the canonical penalty attached would suggest, on the contrary, that church authorities were concerned with the maintenance and not the introduction of this rule. We don't have any written record of it, but it seems pretty likely that this had been an expected practice long before the year 305. It's also important to note, however much of a technicality, that this is not a prohibition against marriage, but an insistence on continence. Married men were not excluded from being ordained, but they were required to cease living like a married person. Similar statements can be found in the Council of Arles in 314, the Council of Nicaea in 325, and the Council of Carthage in 380. None of these councils require candidates to be unmarried, only that they be continent once ordained. Pope Siricius in the 4th century is the first pope we have to comment on this topic, reiterating the previous teaching, and Pope Leo the Great is quick to follow. The law of continence is the same for the ministers of the altar, for the bishops, and for the priests. When they were still lay people or lectors, they could freely take a wife and beget children. But once they have reached the ranks mentioned above, what had been permitted is no longer so. The reason for this goes all the way back to the Old Testament, where the priests were required to temporarily abstain from sex before offering the sacrifice. For Pope Siricius, the ideal had always been for the priest to remain chaste, but since this was impossible, as the tribe of Levi needed to procreate to stay alive, only temporary continence was required. Now, with no need to pass down a tribal lineage, priests could remain pure without any exceptions. So, it's settled. By 305, the practice is well established, and for a few hundred years after that, no pope or bishop questions the teaching, and there was never a problem again. Right? Not exactly. In many ways, the Church regressed in the early Middle Ages. Lay investiture, the process by which secular leaders chose bishops rather than the pope, led to many men entering the clergy who were untrained and unfit for the life. Add this to the complete destabilization of the Western world, and the Church lost significant control over its clergy. Priests began to openly live with wives, even concubines. Moral depravity was taking over the priesthood. So what did the church do? It depends on which side of the world you lived on. The Eastern Church began to relax its laws. The Council of Trullo in 691 decreed that bishops were to remain unmarried, and that priests and deacons were not to marry after being ordained, but that priests and deacons could continue to live as married men if they were married before ordination. This did not exactly please the Western Church. Not only was this council rejected by then Pope St. Sturgis, but the papacy made sure that it doubled down on this long-accepted teaching. In 653, the Council of Toledo prohibited clergy from having relationships with their wives. The Frankish Synod of 743 banned clergy from living in the same house as their wives, and dioceses began to require candidates for the priesthood to make a vow of chastity before being ordained. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Church was undergoing major reforms in the Western world, culminating in the decree by the Second Lateran Council in 1139, requiring mandatory celibacy for all future priests. That the law of continence and purity, so pleasing to God, may become more general among persons constituted in sacred orders, we decree that bishops, priests, deacons, subdeacons, canons regular, monks, and professed clerics who, transgressing the holy precept, have dared to contract marriage, shall be separated. For a union of this kind, which has been contracted in violation of ecclesiastical law, we do not regard as matrimony. There could be no clearer or more binding of a statement. There are no exceptions and no ambiguities. No clergyman can be married, and if he attempts so, the marriage is invalid and he is separated from the priesthood. While it still took until the institution of the seminary system in the 16th century to totally enforce this law, from this moment on, it has stood as the unquestioned law of the Church. But that's not to say it couldn't change. Just as the Eastern Church pivoted in its understanding in the Middle Ages, there is nothing preventing the Catholic Church from doing the same without disobeying this decree of the Ecumenical Council. Because the law itself is a discipline of the Church, not a matter of dogma, the Church has the authority, within itself, to change the requirements of priesthood. Already ordained ministers will never be allowed to get married, as this has been prohibited since the very beginning of the Church, but it is within the tradition of the Church to allow already married men to become priests. Pope Francis himself has said that this is a possibility, stating, since it is not a dogma, the door is always open, and he has considered removing the requirement on a few occasions. And this isn't just Pope Francis talking. The Second Vatican Council refers to it as a discipline, and Pope Benedict himself acknowledged in his book Light of the World that it is something that could be changed. Will it? It's hard to know the future. What we do know is our past. And from our past, we see that it has long been a discipline meant at focusing the clergy on the things of heaven, keeping them pure and unencumbered, and serving as the spouse of the Church and shepherd of the whole human family. There is no shortage of people who believe that making this optional would make the priesthood better, and that very well may be the case, but there is also no denying that there would be something lost in the change. We mustn't overlook the great gift that celibacy can be to the priest and to the whole Church.